Hey folks, this is Dr. Jimmy Red. Good to talk with y'all again. Today I'm going to give it a little lecture on the books from the Hebrew Bible, Esther and Ruth. We're going to do a literary analysis here. It's not a Sunday school lesson. It's going to be looking at it through an objective lens, trying to look at different interpretations, uh, just as if it's another book. Even though we all have our own beliefs and things such as that, we're going to look at it in a more objective light, like we've been looking at other books of literature. So to give you a little bit of an overview of the book of Esther, uh, this is a book that is set within the time of exile as the Jews were uh, put into exile by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and they were living over there in modern Iraq and Iran and areas such as that. But now the Persians are ruling over them. And notoriously, all the books of the Bible present this as a miserable period for the Jews at this time. Here we have a key character in the biblical book called Ahasuerus. This cat, most scholars think, is the Persian Emperor Xerxes I, who historically fought against the Greeks in that famous battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartan 300s and stuff like that. If you've seen the movie 300, you might have seen him before, or a presentation of him, I should say. So let's look at how this cat is portrayed in the book that we're reading here. He is one of the key characters, King Ahasuerus of Persia, who is ruling over the Jews. Also, we see Queen Vashti in this chapter. We'll have other key characters in the book are going to be Esther. We'll have Mordecai, and Haman, of course, is the villain of the work. So some themes going on in this work. We'll see we'll see cunning presented again in the ways that Esther is going to overcome the circumstances that face her. We're going to see courage in the character of Esther and also in the character of Mordecai. We're going to see other things such as, what is it like to be in exile? What is it like to be in submission to someone else? What is it like, or how can you overcome those problems? We're going to see some unjust laws established and some just laws established, almost as if, like in some other books of the Bible that we've been reading, there has to be a faith in destiny. We might suffer for a little while, but eventually right or righteousness will overcome evil. Okay, looking a little more closely at certain chapters. Let's start with chapter 1. If you have your book, break it out. Or in this case, if you're reading it online, go ahead and bring up chapter 1. I'm going to highlight some key passages and talk about why they're key passages, and I'm also going to talk about some key characters. If you have your quiz, you can start filling out the quiz right there as well. So chapter 1, we see again Ahasuerus introduced, and we have Vashti and the king's advisors are the cats in this chapter here. So the first thing that we see about Ahasuerus is, you could say, while he displayed the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and pomp of his majesty for 180 days, so half of a year he's sitting there displaying how great he is. So you could call him pompous or prideful. The Jews don't have a lot of love and affection for the Persians, who are their masters overall, and you can see that from most of the books that we're seeing here. At the same time, kings at the time had to do these kinds of things to establish their right. Other Other things to note about the character of this feast that's going on. Ahasuerus is throwing a feast right here to show off his splendor and all of these things. Is that he is allowing people to drink without restraint, quote unquote, for the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as each one desired. So we see here a lack of restraint is criticized, I believe, if you read through this text. The inability to restrain oneself with drink, in this case right here, seems to be a negative trait of the king. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded some of his servants, some of his eunuchs, to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. Okay, so look at what he values. He values her. It doesn't talk about how he values her for her mental traits, for her wisdom and intellect, or her ability to be a politician. Instead, he values her for her beauty. He wants to show off. He's already showed off his other things he wants to show off. Now he wants to show off his wife's immeasurable beauty. Okay, so you could criticize him for that if you wish to. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. At this, the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. So there's a couple different ways to interpret this. You could look at Vashti as a feminist character. I don't necessarily think this work is showing her in a positive light, and the rabbinical tradition does not show her in the positive light. It shows her as evil and proud and vain, too vain to come. It shows it as a negative thing that she does this. But modern feminist interpretations of this look at her as, well, look, the king's wasted and drunk, and he's a braggart, and he's full of his ego, and he just wants to show me off for my beauty. So she refuses to come. And so you could see that as a positive thing. Again, I don't think that the text intends for that to be the case, but you could raise a criticism of the text. So looking forward at it a little further, according to the law, what's to be done to Queen Vashti? So the king asks his advisors, what does the law say about how I should react to this? He gets mad and angry, like some of the other characters we've been reading about, like Odysseus and cats like that. It should be noted he doesn't act completely irrationally here. He goes and he asks his advisors their advice. And so in a lot of the ancient texts, that shows a sign of wisdom. You interpret it however you wish to, but it seems as if this is a smart thing, according to the text, to go reach out to his advisors. Look at how the advisors advise him to act. They say, look, she is an ideal woman according to the whole of the populace, the whole of the state, all the way from India to Ethiopia, most of the known world to these people. Not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen will be made known to be all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they'll say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. So here we see a reason that justifies, according to these people, patriarchy. If indeed a woman does not do what a man says, then this is going to cause trouble throughout all of the kingdom, specifically the queen, who is supposed to be an ideal woman. If she doesn't act well toward the king, people aren't going to respect the king anymore, and that could cause problems. It could cause rebellions. And also it could cause problems in all of the court, because then they're going to look on contempt with their husband. That's going to cause problems in all of their households, even down to the lowest of the peoples, even down to slaves and things such as that. Landowners, small landowners, their wives are going to look at them with enmity. So it's going to cause problems. So according to patriarchal rules, this is a reason why the subjection and submissiveness of women is encouraged. Now, you can criticize that, of course, uh, but I think in the reading of the text, this seems to be, the text seems to support this idea. Okay, looking at chapter 2. So the key characters in chapter 2 are Mordecai and Esther. So these are going to be the heroes of the work. Look at how, and now Mordecai and Esther are cats that you could write about in the exam, or you could write about them on the quiz. Look at how Mordecai is characterized in chapter 2. He adopted this girl as his own daughter, even though he didn't have to. He takes her under his wing. He takes care of her. He protects her. We talked about how in Genesis 1, that's how Yahweh or God was portrayed in a lot of the books. It sought to portray him as a protector, as a guider, and things such as that. Doing right as opposed to wrong. Righteousness as opposed to unrighteousness. He checks in on her. He checks in on her welfare. We see that a lot of times in the Word. Then look at how Esther is characterized according to the book. It characterized her as obedient toward Mordecai. So in a lot of these ancient works we're reading, these are things that are valued. We see obedience valued. We see acting according to moral sense of justiceness and fairness, according to your own kin especially. We see that in other works, and doing right by them. We see all of these, them echoing those aspects. Then we also learn of Mordecai discovering a plot to kill King Ahasuerus, and even though he is a slave in exile in this faraway land, he does, according to his own sense of moral justice, reveal that plot to the king. So these are some interesting key character traits of these cats early on. So looking at chapter 3 of Esther, we see the villain Haman introduced. It should be noted, we don't quite know nowadays. There's disagreement about where Agag is, but it's clear that there seems to be some kind of enmity, ethnical enmity between the Jews and Haman's people. So there's a couple of different ways to interpret this right here. But that's kind of what is going on behind Mordecai's confrontation and refusal to respect Haman and refusing to obey, which is also the king's command right here. So it's interesting to note that there's kind of a dilemma. There's two different ways of looking at obedience in this work right here. In one sense, you're supposed to obey the people who are above you, in the sense that, Esther is portrayed positively because she obeys Mordecai. But in this case right here, he doesn't obey the king's command. So it seems as if there's a qualifier there. You should obey a thematic statement, is like you should obey those with authority higher than you if indeed they have a sense of justice. And of course, for the Jews, the ultimate sense of justice is established by the Torah. Okay, and Haman, because of this, it should be noted his character right here. He has a great sense of pride. He is usually portrayed as that way. He's got this huge sense of pride, and he wants to see himself praised. He's got a big ego. And because his ego was harmed by this little slight incident, look at how he reacts egregiously. He goes to King Ahasuerus and gets the condoned genocide of the Jews. So look at how he justifies that genocide there. And of course, when I say genocide, it's hard not to think about Hitler. Look at how they're portrayed. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it's not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands, so that they may put it into the king's treasury. So the king agrees to this, and it should be noted the character of the king there. He's greedy, and Haman is appealing to his greed. Look at the justification behind it. These people are different from us. They're not like us. So it seems to justify that those who are different from you are worth of destruction. It seems to justify that. And of course, within the context of this work, it's presenting this idea as a deplorable one right here. It'll be interesting to look at how that bleeds into the book of Ruth. If you want to draw a comparison contrast between these two books, that's a key comparison contrast, because here we have people condoning genocide of people of different races and ethnicities and laws and religion, whereas in the other book, in Ruth, it seems to say, no, you shouldn't destroy these people who have different values and stuff like that. You should treat them with hospitality. So it'll be interesting to look at those, comparing thematically those ideas. And look at what happens in this final quote right here after the king agrees to what Haman wants him to do. His city, the capital city of Susa, was thrown into confusion. So those who act in ways such as this, treating exiles in this fashion, can throw cities into confusion, which could potentially undermine his rule. Moving on to chapter 4 here, let's take a look at Mordecai's sorrow. Mordecai reacts with sorrow to this new rule that's been handed out, the annihilation of the Jews condoned by the state. Considering that within the context of the Holocaust would be an excellent second-level connection. If those of you who are not familiar with that, I draw distinctions between talking about stuff that you can reveal from the text or new critical analysis versus stuff that you can connect to outside of the text. So this destruction of the Jews within Esther can be connected to something outside of the text, the Holocaust, a real-life event. So Mordecai famously puts himself in sackcloth and ashes to demonstrate his sorrow outwardly, his inward sorrow outwardly. And we also see in this chapter Esther's charge. She's charged with a hard task, a task that could easily lead to her death, but she shows courage in the face of that task. So let's look at a couple key quotes here. It says, Esther says to Mordecai when he charges her with this, to go to the king and ask for him for help. She says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king without being called, there's but one law. All of them alike are to be put to death. So apparently there's a law in Persia that you can't come and approach the king without him calling you first. And it seems as if with Vashti, if you don't come when he calls you, you could face death as well. So this is what she faces right here. And Mordecai says to her, he says, don't think that in the king's palace you'll escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you've come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. So there's a lot to unpack behind Mordecai's words right here. He says, look, you are in the king's palace, but when this genocide happens, it's going to come to you as well. And keeping in mind the covenant that God has with Abraham here, that's what's behind what he's saying right here. He says, the Jews are going to be delivered. If you don't step up, then somebody else is going to step up, and you're going to suffer because you didn't do what God wanted you to do. You didn't do what destiny wanted you to. And so, again, pointing to this Hebrew idea that destiny drives all the things that we do toward that ultimate idea of the Jews being the inheritors of the promised land and all that stuff. Perhaps that's why she got up to this high state, is because of God's will. Then look at what Esther says she takes on the task, demonstrating her courage. She says, but before doing it, she gets all of her people behind her. She asks for solidarity. We're going to see this connected with Ruth and how she shows solidarity toward Naomi, and how Boaz shows solidarity or family obligations, family ties toward Naomi and toward Ruth as well. And she's willing to go against the law. So it's interesting how this presents a take on obedience. Sometimes it seems as if a law is unjust, we should, excuse me, bless me, we should, or we have a right to go against the law. It's interesting to connect that with cats like Thoreau in modern 19th century American literature, and his essay on civil disobedience, justifying breaking of laws. Or you could connect it with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King in the 20th century and African American rights. And she says, if I perish, I perish. All right, moving forward a little more quickly, chapters 5, 6, and 7 from Esther, we see her plan, and we also see her cunning. She sets up a careful plan, and I think it's interesting to draw a connection between, or comparison contrast from her to Vashti. Esther knows her role as a woman. She knows, she's aware that if she reacts like Vashti did, that she's going to suffer terribly to what the king did. So she has a subtle plan to gain his acceptance. And so this is a demonstration of how women can be intelligent by using the rules of her culture to her own advantage right here. It's a different type of feminism. It's a way that women could come to empowerment in the face of a patriarchal society without suffering death. It was the only way available to them at that time. But then again, sometimes interpretations of the text praise Vashti more and Esther less because, it is undoubtedly a little more heroic, I think they argue, to stand up for rights and be willing to become a martyr in that sense here. But I'll leave it up to you to decide which way I think the text presents her as heroic for these qualities. We also see Haman's character. We've already talked about that to a great degree, his ego, and also how he gets his just deserts. This is a theme of divine justice right here, a sense of ideal justice. In the end, those who spread evil will receive evil, and Haman, in this ironic show, has to lead Mordecai through a procession that praises him, while at the same time he's planning his demise on a gallows that he's building. So beyond Haman, thinking about connections you can draw beyond the work in a thematic statement, the work talks about the consequences of having a huge ego. In the case here, that's illustrated by Haman. Look at the response of Haman's family. Haman's family says, yeah, sorry, you've lost now. So they anticipate his end. And in chapter 7, Esther's plan reaches its climax. As it says there, if I've won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That's my petition. That is my request. For my people and I have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. So she stands up for it, and he says, who does this? And she says, Haman, that evil guy right there. And this is ultimately when her plan reaches a climax. She waited patiently, feasting the king several times until and gaining his favor before she asked for this. And before she reveals this. So that shows her smarts, her intelligence. Chapter 8 to 10, we see Esther saves her people. We also see this sense of divine vengeance. The Jews enact their vengeance, which is part of their destiny. It's interesting that some people are so afraid of the Jews that they profess to be Jews. We see the establishment of Jewish festival of Purim. And finally, we see this little bit about Mordecai. How did things end up for him? This sense of those who do right are rewarded that we saw in the Odyssey is also emphasized here. Mordecai is rewarded. He was powerful among the Jews and popular with his kindred, for he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his descendants. So these were traits that were talked about in Genesis as some of the character traits of God or Yahweh, and they're also emphasized as here. So a good ruler should act like God does. A good ruler should protect his people. A good ruler should seek for the good of his people, not only his selfish interests. Now looking on to our second book that we're looking at, which is Ruth. Both of these books have very strong female characters, Esther, and in here we have two, Ruth and Naomi. So an overview of the book, we have those characters, Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz are the key characters. This is written during the time of when the Jews had their own state. So not the time of exile whenever they had been in captivity in Babylonia and Persia. This was before that. But it still is a story of exile because there's a famine in the land, and Ruth goes with her husband and her two sons to this land, Moab, and her sons get wives, but there's pestilence, and her husband and those two sons die, and she's left alone with no man, which in this society basically means you could starve to death because it's a patriarchal society. Only men can own land and things such as that. So you're in trouble if you're a woman without a man in this time. And so she's left destitute in a foreign land, and foreigners aren't treated with hospitality in this land of Moab. So it's about the experience of exile and loneliness. And Ruth is faced with this situation, yet her two daughters-in-law, both of them, Orpah and Ruth, express the need for sisterly love and companionship or friendship, and the need for oppressed to stick together. That's what's going on in this interaction here. They say they're going to stick with her. They're going to help her out in her time of distress, and that's presented as a positive thing. So some key passages from chapter 1. It's interesting how Naomi says that she's going to leave the land of Moab and go back to Israel, Judah, I believe. And she says the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So the famine ended. And it's interesting, in other translations, it says the Lord blesses his people and gives them food, or he remembers his people. So think about it. Think about what that means. The Lord is, through the Lord, this is how we're blessed. It's a power higher than us that is responsible of our blessings, not our own actions and things like that. So remember how we were talking about when we talked about the Odyssey, how there were these competing themes of whether it was our will, whether our actions which determine how things ended up, or whether things were predetermined from the get-go, whether a lot of things were out of our control. And it seems as if this work, and time again, is emphasizing the latter right there. It is the Lord's power that determines whether we suffer or whether we're redeemed. But Naomi said to her two daughters, y'all should go back, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you. as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security. So this shows the character of Naomi. If you want to talk about her on the quiz or on the exam, her character is she wishes the best for her two daughters-in-law. She could have reacted selfishly and pled with them to come with her, but she doesn't. So looking on, chapter 1, some more. Look at how her two daughters react with true, ideal sisterly love. They weep aloud. They say, "No, we'll return with you." So they show self-sacrifice. Women are presented positively in this book. They're strong. They stick with each other, and by doing this, they can empower each other. But there's a distinction between Orpah and Ruth. When pressed, Orpah reacts with, you could argue, selfishness, ultimately. She sticks with herself. I think that's a little harsh on Orpah to say that, considering the circumstances. But Ruth sticks with her. And so that shows her as a true hero. It's interesting, and again, the hand of the Lord has turned against me is what Naomi blames. These are Naomi's words. So she says that it's God who is, I wouldn't say at fault, but he is the one who is behind this suffering right here. She doesn't give an explanation, but the Lord drives all things in this work right here. So looking at Ruth's words, this is one of my favorite passages from the Bible, and it's one of the more famous passages of the Bible. It's where Ruth shows her solidarity with Naomi. It's where Ruth is willing to sacrifice herself for Naomi. She says, in a true sign of female solidarity, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried." And it's because of her love and her affection for Naomi. Now, I keep emphasizing sisterly love, but this could apply to brotherly love as well. I think that you could argue that any human sense of self-sacrifice, of sticking with someone else, a friend, be it a friend, a brother, a relative, or just a stranger. This is a sense of ideal love and companionship. Looking on at chapter 2 right here, we see Boaz come in. And so we see his character presented immediately. He's going to be presented as an ideal man, according to the word. He says to the reapers, "The Lord be with you," and they answered, "The Lord bless you." So look at how he treats his servants. He doesn't have to treat his servants well, but he does. He blesses them. He wishes good upon them. And because he does that, it's implied that his reapers also wish good upon him as well. So we see an ideal relationship between servant and master, and you could connect that to the Odyssey, where we see ideal relationships between servants and masters. Then we see Ruth. She comes out into the fields. It's hard to understand from our modern context what's happening, but whenever you glean wheat, apparently there is some left over, and they don't necessarily pick that up. I know that with cotton that's the case. For instance, I've seen that happen. And so it seems like she's going behind there and picking up the rest. I know that there's a law, I believe in Leviticus or Deuteronomy, that establishes this as the due rewards, or this is the things that are due to the poor. So it's like a law. You could compare it to welfare nowadays, for instance. Those who are poor, it is a law that you should help to take care of them. And this is established in the Bible even, and in the Torah. So this law is around. It's a way to protect those who are unfortunate and things such as that. So look at her character. She comes, and Naomi's too old to work, I assume. And so she's helping Naomi by getting this little bit of barley to feed them. And ostensibly, this is going to have to feed them until the next crop comes in, whatever she gets here. Look at how she acts. She acts without resting, even for a moment. So it shows her character. her determination, her endurance. She's not lazy. And Boaz says to her, now listen, my daughter, look at how he calls her right here. He learns that she's a kin. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that's being reaped and follow behind them. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So connecting to the Odyssey right here, we're going to see this law of hospitality, how you're supposed to treat others, strangers. In her case, a foreigner. You could compare and contrast that with discussions going on about how one should treat immigrants nowadays, for instance. In this case right here, you should treat someone like this with compassion and hospitality. Look at it. She says right here, why should you take notice of me when I'm a foreigner? And he justifies it and says, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people you did not know before. So this is a hard thing, to go into exile, to go into a place that you don't know. And he sees that sacrifice that she does for her mother-in-law as a reason for this reward. May the Lord reward you for your deeds. And so he's not only just saying God is going to reward you, he enacts the divine will by doing as the Lord would wish for him to do. So this is ideally how a man should act. A man should act, according to the work, it seems, is protecting those who are less fortunate, protecting those who deserve it. Looking at chapters 2, 3, and 4, this is going to be the last slide here, trying to wrap things up. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. So it emphasizes the idea that you should respect the living and the dead, that God's laws, or laws beyond our power, moral laws, go beyond death. Where you could expect, if you treated somebody in real life, maybe you could get a reward from that person later. This sense says that you should treat the dead well because you'll be rewarded later. Chapter 3, we see the duties of a mother to a daughter. You see that Naomi's duty toward Ruth is to give her good advice and to look after her welfare. And the daughter also, she has a duty to her mother. So you should talk about family duty if you wanted to create a thematic statement and what this implies about it. Here's another quote. I'm Ruth, your servant. Now Naomi tells Ruth to go and meet Boaz in this famous scene where she uncovers his feet here, which there's a couple different ways to interpret that. Perhaps it's a euphemism for sex, or another way to interpret it is that she lies at her master's feet, showing that she's submissive to him, or underneath his feet. That's another way to interpret it. Both ways are interpretations that could be valid. She says, I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant. The key point is here that she goes into him and she asks for his support. She says, I'm your servant. She shows herself to be submissive to him, and she asks for his protection. You could compare, contrast this to in the Odyssey when folks grab the knees of other cats, and how that shows submissiveness and how they are supposed to protect that person. And he says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first, talking about what she did to Naomi. For you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. So it's implied there that this action is actually better than the other one. I'll leave for you to interpret that. But it has something to do with showing that she's selfless. She does what she's supposed to do. And she's not as concerned with riches or poverty. I'll leave it up to you to look at that and to draw some conclusions about that. Chapter 4, note Boaz's deal that he makes, which demonstrates his knowledge and duty of the law as well as his cunning. So in chapter 4, we see Boaz make a deal. I think you could talk about his character and how he knows the law and he uses it to his advantage. He knows the rules of his society and uses them to his advantage. And this shows his intelligence and also his determination and his love for Ruth. Let's not forget that this is a love story. And let's look at how this marriage is blessed and how it has implications moving on forward throughout the rest of the Bible. At the end, it says, the people who notice this pact say, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah." So key matriarchs that we talked about in the Bible who together built up the house of Israel. And in fact, then we get a genealogy of the house of David. So who is historically, he and Solomon, the greatest rulers of Israel, and ideal kings in many ways. In other ways, they make mistakes. But in the Christian tradition, of course, we're reading the Hebrew Bible here. In the Christian tradition, David is an ancestor of Jesus. So in the Christian tradition, this is often looked at as a person who acted in an ideal way, and she is even in the line of Jesus. So you could say, like, to act like Ruth is to act like Jesus in a way. So that would be an interesting interpretation to make as well. Okay, my friends, it's been fun talking with you about these two books of the Bible here and to draw some thoughts about this. Now I want to hear from y'all with some questions and things like that. You can leave questions in the comment box. If you have your own interpretations and things, feel free to provide them. It's the way I read a work is to provide many different interpretations, not necessarily to say that one is better than the other. And of course, I'm reading this book in a secular sense, not a religious sense. Keep that in mind. And I don't wish to, step on anybody's toes to favor one interpretation over another. This is meant to provide a healthy and productive discussion of the work. So I look forward to hearing your contributions and your questions. Have fun.